Hello and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum. In this set of videos, we're going to look at the sixth time period covered in APUSH, which covers the years 1865 through 1898. You will notice that once again, the early part of this time period overlaps with the end of the last one. So some of the information and events from the last era are still quite important to this one. The key concepts for this era focus on the technological advances, large-scale production methods, and the opening of new markets, which encouraged the rise of industrial capitalism in the U.S. We will also look at the migrations that accompanied industrialization that transformed both urban and rural areas of the U.S. and caused dramatic social and cultural change. In addition, we will look at the Gilded Age, which produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. In our Unit 7, the topics we will look at include westward expansion, with closer looks at economic, social, and cultural development, the New South, technological innovations in the late 19th century, the rise of industrial capitalism, labor in the Gilded Age, immigration and migration, and the responses to it, the development of the middle class, reform in the Gilded Age, and controversies over the role of government and politics in this Gilded Age. So in this video, we will be looking at Topic 6.2, which along with Topic 6.3, looks at the causes and effects of westward expansion in the latter half of the 19th century. This one specifically looks at economic development, whereas the next one will focus on social and cultural development. But know that they are very interrelated and even address the same key objective question. So let's get started. As a reminder, expansion westward had been a part of the American identity since before the U.S. even officially existed. First, from expansion past the Appalachian Mountains to the manifest destiny of the 1840s. This movement into the West was really just a continuation of that manifest destiny, with modernism replacing the old ways, and with the new ways seen as almost an enlightenment of sorts. And this continued both during and after the Civil War. Perhaps the best recognized aspect of the West was the farming frontier. Encouraged to settle there by passage of the Homestead Act of 1862, some 500,000 Americans moved out west during the Gilded Age. The law offered 160 acres of land for free to anyone who could improve and maintain it, or you could buy it outright for $1.25 an acre, which was just $200 for that 160-acre farm. But there were problems that many of these homesteaders had not anticipated. While 160 acres was sufficient land for farming along the East Coast, this area was characterized by extreme weather, plagues of grasshoppers, scarce water, and lack of wood for building and fences, which means 160 acres actually was not going to be enough. But still, between 1860 and 1910, the number of farms in the U.S. tripled, increasing from 2 to 6 million, while the area farmed more than doubled from 160 million to 352 million hectares. Between 1860 and 1890, the production of such basic commodities like wheat, corn, and cotton outstripped all previous figures in U.S. history. In the same period, the nation's population more than doubled, with the largest growth in cities. But the American farmer was growing enough grain and cotton, raising enough beef and pork, and clipping enough wool to not only supply American workers and their families, but to also create surpluses that could be sold to a world market. And new and improved agricultural machinery and techniques were improving the efficiency of American agriculture. The lack of fencing was solved by the invention of barbed wire by Joseph Glidden in 1874. A lack of water might be combated by drilling wells extra deep and practicing what was called dry farming techniques with wider rows, strict weed control, and crops that could tolerate drought, as well as different tilling techniques. Farmers also had new, and usually expensive, machinery that was doing more and more of the labor associated with agriculture, allowing them to produce more and more with less and less people, which of course sent many former farm laborers into the industrial cities. For example, in 1830, it took about 250 to 300 labor hours to produce 100 bushels or 5 acres of wheat, with a walking plow, a brush harrow, hand broadcasting the seed, and hand sickle. And by the time you get to 1850, for a similar look, it took about 75 to 90 labor hours to produce 100 bushels of corn, which was about 2.5 acres. Again, that was with hand planting and hand harvesting. By the time you get to 1890, only 35 to 40 labor hours was required to produce 100 bushels of corn, and 40 to 50 labor hours was required to produce 100 bushels of wheat, because you had things like a gang plow, a seeder, a harrowing machine, a binder, a thresher, harvesting machinery that made the job easier. Cattlemen and ranchers also noted the vast open grasslands that existed from Texas all the way to Canada. A calf bought for $5 in southern Texas might sell for $60 in Chicago. The problem, of course, was getting the cattle to market. The construction of railroads boosted the trade, and millions of people flooded out west to raise cattle on the grasslands of America's frontier. Doing so would not only increase the population, it would also change America's diet from pork to beef, and it would create a new occupation, the cowboy. Raising, which had long been an important industry in Texas, would particularly flourish after the Civil War, when began driving their Texas longhorn cattle north across the open public land to railway centers in places like Kansas. Cowboys escorted or drove the cattle the entire distance, which was about 1,500 miles. And along the way, the cattle enjoyed all the grass they wanted, at no cost to the ranchers. Feeding as they went, these cattle arrived at rail centers much larger and fatter than when they started. And at places like Abilene and Dodge City, the cattle would be sold and then board rail cars for their journey to the slaughterhouses near places like Chicago, and the cowboys themselves returned to Texas. Soon this long drive became a regular event, and for hundreds of miles, trails were dotted with herds of cattle moving northward. Cattle raising then spread into the Trans-Missouri region, and immense ranches appeared in Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota territories, with the same concept: move the cattle along open public grazing lands until you got to rail centers. Western cities like Chicago then flourished as centers for the slaughter and dressing of meat, and especially since refrigerated rail cars allowed meat to be prepared farther away from the major cities. The heyday of the cattle boom, though, ended when the blizzards and droughts of 1885 to 1886 killed 90% of the cattle on the frontier. From then on, it was clear that cattle needed to be raised on large ranches, which could supplement their feed during severe weather. The rapid expansion of production in agriculture also resulted in falling prices, prompting many to plant even more or take out loans against future crops. Of course, if those crops failed, farmers lost title to their lands when banks foreclosed on their property. This then prompted larger investors to begin buying land and investing in irrigation technology, which your typical farmer could not afford, and then renting that land back to the original farmers, which in turn brings tenant farming and even sharecropping to the western farms. Large companies, especially railroad corporations, often took advantage of farmers by increasing prices, since, let's face it, there's no other way for farmers to get their crops to market except via rail, and the same was true of those who were moving cattle along the rails. Discontented farmers tried to organize and fight back against banks and corporations that seemed to be taking advantage of them. The National Grange movement, which began when the National Grange of Patrons and Husbandry was established in 1868, was at first a social and educational organization created to help farmers and their families, but over time it became active in political and economic spheres to help its members. They established cooperatives, which were farming businesses that were owned and run by a group of farmers to save costs, like pooling resources to purchase expensive equipment, which they would then all share, or using their sort of collective power to negotiate deals with shippers. They lobbied to get laws passed to regulate businesses, especially railroads. And eventually, these farmers' alliances evolved into state and regional groups that helped to educate farmers and organize politically. The National Farmers Alliance met to form a platform, almost like a political party, in 1890, supporting some of the key reforms of the day that eventually get passed in the early 20th century, including ideas of like the direct election of senators, lower tariffs, progressive income taxes, a new federal banking system, farm subsidies, as well as changes to the monetary system. Although this national grange doesn't become a national political party, they do set the precedent for the eventual formation of the Populist Party in the 1890s. Now, since we've mentioned railroads, let's take a moment and look at where all these railroads are coming from. Before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the only Americans to venture westward had done so on horseback or on Conestoga wagons, or potentially even taking ships down around South America and landing on the coast of California. But really, this wasn't particularly efficient. Remember, in the 1850s, the U.S. government was already looking at the possibility of Transcontinental Railroad. It's why the Gadsden Purchase had been completed down in southern Arizona and New Mexico. In 1862, Congress passed the first of the Pacific Railroad Acts, in which the federal government would grant huge swaths of land directly to railroad companies to aid in the construction of a railroad and telegraph line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, and to secure to the government the use of the same for postal, military, and other purposes. The building of a transcontinental railroad could also potentially help the Union win the war, although it didn't begin construction until really late in the war and after the war itself had ended. But for each mile of track laid by the Central and Union Pacific Railroads, the companies would receive 640 acres of public land. In other rail projects, state governments often kicked in additional acres for a growing number of rail companies, with all in all the railroad companies receiving about 200 million acres of land from the U.S. government for fulfilling these contracts. Union Pacific workers, many of whom were Irish and Chinese immigrants, started at Omaha, Nebraska, and hammered their way westward. From Sacramento, California, the Central Pacific made its way eastward with the assistance of thousands of Chinese immigrants. The government declared that the two lines would merge at Promontory Summit near Ogden, Utah. On May 10, 1869, Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific Railroad, was provided the honor to hammer a golden spike into the ground that marked the completion of this first coast-to-coast line. Soon 4 more transcontinental lines were constructed, almost all with the help of government land grants, and travel across the continent became much simpler, less expensive, and much faster. The engineering achievement was monumental, and these steaming locomotives would hasten Western settlement, spread democratic values, and increase the number of states. The last cause of the expansion westward in the late 19th century was the development of the mining frontier. Since gold had been discovered in 1848 in California, the West had always lured those who were hoping to strike it rich. Thousands of optimistic Americans, and even many foreigners, dreamed of finding a bonanza and retiring at a young age. Pike's Peak or bust had been the motto of many gold seekers who ventured west during the 1859 Colorado Gold Rush. The increase of gold and silver related to these strikes actually caused value issues for the U.S. dollar and created a currency crisis that affected the entire nation. Strikes of gold and silver were found in every Western territory. Nevada claimed the Comstock lode, which was the largest of the American silver strikes. But it wasn't just gold or silver that was valuable. Eastern industry required lead and other precious metals. The inventions of the telephone, the light bulb, the dynamo, which was a generator that could pump electricity into people's homes, all required copper wiring. As a result, places from Coeur d'Alene in Idaho to Tombstone in Arizona, boom towns popped up across the American West. But of course, the chances of an individual prospector in these towns finding a valuable lode of metal was actually very slim. These gold seekers worked stream beds, filling a pan with sediment and water, shaking heavier nuggets of metal, which would then sink to the bottom as the dirt and such would wash away. But eventually these primitive methods gave way to deep shaft mining. Anybody ever been on the mine ride at Knott's Berry Farm? Large machinery was required to dig into the earth, to split the quartz where the gold and other metals were hidden. This was too large of an operation for an individual prospector. Eastern investors were the ones who conducted these ventures, and often profited handsomely. The best-case scenario for a prospector was now to locate a large deposit and then sell the claim to one of these large corporations. But Western mining created environmental problems. Rock dust from drilling was often dumped into riverbeds, forming silt deposits downstream that could lead to flooding both in towns and on farmland. Miners and farmers were often at odds with each other over the effects of one enterprise on the other. Poisonous underground gases, mostly containing sulfur, were released into the atmosphere. Removing gold from quartz required mercury, the excess of which polluted local streams and rivers. Strip mining caused erosion and further desertification, turning large areas of semi-arid land into deserts where nothing would grow. But there was little regulation of this mining industry, at least not until the early 20th century. All right, so that's pretty much what you need to know about topic 6.2 of the AP US History curriculum. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.